Hello, Out Entrepreneurs. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to episode number 23 of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. On today's show, I am really happy to host an out and proud journalist, Katie Barnes, who is calling all the way from Bristol, Connecticut. So, Katie, welcome to the show. Are you ready to inspire fellow out bosses?
Yeah, totally. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. So more about Katie. Katie is a pop culture obsessed writer for ESPNW, covering culture, LGBTQ issues, women's basketball, and MMA. And since joining ESPN in August of 2015, Katie has written on myriad topics such as campus sexual assault, the sports world's response to North Carolina's controversial law HB2, American Ninja Warrior, Pitch, and more. So, Katie, we are really, really lucky to have you on the show. To kick us off, can you share just a little bit more about how you're serving as an entrepreneur inside of ESPN and what makes your role unique?
Yeah, so I'm a writer-reporter on the staff of ESPNW, but we're located within the headquarters of ESPN proper. And so of our thousands of employees around the world, ESPN's headquarters in Bristol has about 4,000 or 5,000 of them. So this is really where it happens. And the great thing about working within digital media is how collaborative of a space it is. So for myself, as both an LGBTQ person, but also as somebody who covers LGBTQ topics and issues and policy, I'm often asked to look at language, asked about how do we cover certain things. And I'm able to sort of voice my opinion in that way and help shape some of our coverage, and as well as educating fellow journalists and editors about how we shouldn't dead name trans people and how maybe we shouldn't mention this thing because it actually might inadvertently out someone, or give people high fives when they're doing a great job. And so ESPN isn't always thought of as a place where that level of collaboration can happen, or that is particularly LGBTQ friendly. I think people are surprised when I talk about it, but that sort of is where I come from in this space.
What you're doing at ESPN is huge. And just for our listeners, traditionally we have entrepreneurs, like pure entrepreneurs on the show. That's who it's geared for. What makes Katie super unique is that taking the same kind of skills that we have as entrepreneurs and really taking innovative ideas and education, in some respects, to really shift the culture with inside organization at ESPN. And also for our listeners too, Katie also does a lot of writing outside of work at ESPN. So for a lot of folks just thinking about getting started, I know many of you are working inside of a bigger organization, thinking about taking that first entrepreneurial leap. It really starts with side hustling. Although it sounds like, Katie, that you're super happy at ESPN, and clearly you've got a really good audience of people seeking your expertise, right? You're writing on a lot of really cool things, and I'm curious right now, what has you most inspired in your role at ESPN and in general as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm very happy at ESPN. I love my job. That for me, what gets me most inspired is really the breadth of the work that I get to do. So, this week I just worked on a piece on Joanna. Joanna Champion is her nickname. Nobody can say her last name well, myself included, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. But she's the current world champion, the strawweight title holder in the UFC. And so that's MMA. And then I'm working on a story about a transgender softball player that I happened to go to high school with, and telling part of his journey, sort of reflecting on that 10 years later. And so those are two very different things in two very different sports. And then, I have to watch Master of None, and I get to write about season 2. So the breadth of the work I get to do is always inspiring. And the fact that it is challenging, but I also have the freedom to write about topics that are particularly personal for me, or things that I'm really passionate about. And so as a journalist, we're really at this time where in the sports world, so many different topics are intersecting with sports in a way that requires a different type of knowledge. And I think I'm really well suited to participate in covering these things, whether it's from race or gender or LGBTQ folks. Those issues are touching sports more and more frequently, and it requires a depth of knowledge and awareness that has not traditionally been present in sports writing. And so for me, as I am really starting my career and building it within a large company, that's a place where I always try and contribute and take it upon myself to be challenged in that way as far as producing good content.
I'm just thinking of my days. I was a student athlete at a different point in time and watching ESPN in the 80s and 90s, so I'm probably dating myself a little bit. And sports, prior to maybe the past couple of years, really seems like a third rail in terms of welcoming LGBTQ folks, and a lot has changed considering the past decade. And I'm curious, when you thought about taking the job at ESPN, did you have any hesitation just knowing the culture or maybe what you thought of ESPN before you accepted that job? Or did you feel driven, purpose driven, knowing what you know about LGBT communities? You clearly have a great lens around intersectionality. So just thinking about race and class and how that fits in to being fully human. What really motivated you to take that job? And did you think at that time that you would have the platform that you do to be as influential as you are around topics, especially thinking about LGBT communities in the world of sports?
Well, I did not have any hesitation. I actually was really drawn to ESPN because of the level of coverage that ESPN has done on LGBTQ people, and also just really great conscious raising work within the sports community. So I loved ESPN as a brand before I really even applied here. And, from the 30 for 30 documentaries to some of our longer pieces in the magazine and even digitally, to the kinds of things that you could find on ESPNW.com, I was seeing a brand and a company that was producing work in a way that I wanted to engage with, that was speaking to me and telling me that I could find a place here as a queer person of color. And so I had no hesitation. I think in terms of, was it surprising to sort of find the level of influence that I personally feel? I mean, I'm not out here changing policy or, it's not like the president, John Skipper, is going to listen to everything I have to say and make different decisions. But within the newsroom and within how we are covering certain things, that conversation has been opened not just to myself, but been open to a huge number of people where anyone who has a thought can really share it. And it's really where that diversity of thought is really important. And I see that within this company. And so I was sort of expecting that when I got here. And it's been really validating and affirming to experience that on a daily level.
That's really powerful. And on the topic of workplace culture, what's one thing that you do either at ESPN with your colleagues to work on creating a more inclusive environment for everyone that you work with, and especially for folks who often feel excluded by dominant culture workplace? Or, if you're thinking about your writing, what's one thing that you're really conscious of when you're writing a story, about MMA, but trying to think about your experiences as a queer person of color, as an athlete? How are you thinking about actively engaging around the culture of inclusivity in the work that you do?
I'm really intentional with words and language. I think that's true of many queer people. We pay really close attention to words and their underlying meanings and placement of words and what that means for us as we try and navigate the world. And as a journalist, I infuse my work with certain phrases that don't disrupt things, but in the moment, might be sending a signal to another queer person that says, hey, this person gets what I'm talking about. Or, in the case where my very first MMA piece, I wrote it about Amanda Nunes, who is the current bantamweight champion in UFC for women. And she's the first gay champion that they've had as a promotion. And so I went down to Florida to cover her and to write this feature and this profile of her right before her fight with Ronda Rousey. And it was a really great experience because Amanda's a queer woman of color. I'm a queer person of color. And so to be able to cover her and to think critically about what does it mean to cover an openly gay champion whose partner is so present, and how can I adequately portray that relationship without writing a gay story when it's supposed to be a sports story? Yeah. And so to be able to do that and engage critically on that level, I thought was really powerful. And it's one of my favorite pieces that I've ever written. And I think is one of those pieces that I can point to say, this is sort of what happens when we talk about gay folks in a way that doesn't just sensationalize what it means to be gay or LGBTQ or queer, and is focusing on that as a part of their lives, if that is how they want. I mean, I guess if that's how they identify. Some folks are a little bit more political about their identities than others. And so for me, it's really all about what makes the most sense for the story, what makes the most sense for the conversations that I need to have within the office walls, and how does that continue to create an inclusive culture beyond just for readers who are engaging with this work, but for myself, for my colleagues. And, we have employee resource groups. I'm a part of a few of them where, whether it's ESPN Women or it's EFAM, ESPN Families, or ESPN Able, or Pulse, which is our Black organization, or Equal for LGBTQ folks and allies, we can have some of those conversations and talk about moments when stuff gets hard, because in a workplace, things are challenging and there are times when it's upsetting, but we have a culture where we can talk about those things. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to shift gears just a bit and talk more about your identity as it falls under the rainbow umbrella. And so when thinking about starting your career as a writer, did being LGBT influence that journey, especially knowing that, like you said, you're very careful with your words. You really want to lift up stories of different people and in all aspects of who they are. So did you see this as an opportunity to really influence and help make the world a little more equitable and just for queer people?
Oh, absolutely. I think when it comes to advocacy work, I have to be careful, and I think about that a lot. My background is in activism, and that's no secret. Whether it was volunteering on campaigns in college or doing advocacy work throughout graduate school, before I came to ESPN, I was more known for advocacy and activism. And then I, sort of stumbled into journalism and into writing. And so I think about that a lot. And for me, it's more about the kinds of stories that I pitch and that I'm able to cover is where I sort of engage with this idea of uplifting stories and talking about queer people in a more holistic way, instead of criticizing policy or railing against policy, which is a little bit of a different thing for me, to be perfectly honest. And so, I just see it as an opportunity. I identify, I'm a biracial person. I'm half Black, half white. I use queer person of color, identify as non-binary. And so when I did this piece on G. Ryan, who is like the first non-binary Division I athlete ever, or at least publicly out, it was a really great opportunity to do that piece in a way that probably most people wouldn't have been able to do, or unless they were deeply, deeply knowledgeable about transgender topics or non-binary topics and familiar with that language. And so as somebody who identifies that way, I was able to really plug in and I think portray G in a way that they would have appreciated. And so that's really what I see in terms of like utilizing my LGBTQ identity in my work directly with LGBTQ people. But I also love to take opportunities that stretch what I do. And so I didn't write about MMA until I wrote about Amanda Nunes. And now I've written 3 additional like smaller profiles of MMA fighters and get to do that a lot. I'm working on a profile of somebody who's in gaming, and that person is trans, but I know I'm going to stick in the gaming and esports world after that because I love it. And so those opportunities are sort of entry points for me. And then I just sort of set up shop and do what I want within those sports, within those spaces. And it really expands my knowledge base and what I'm able to do as a journalist and as a writer.
I love your response to that question because, I mean, you touched on a few things that I think is really helpful for people tuning into the show, which is one, you saw opportunities. You have this background as an advocate, and you saw an opportunity to take a lot of the skills that you gained, especially as an advocate writing and, as you said, kind of railing against policy. Clearly, you know how to kind of deconstruct an argument through the written word, and really taking that and applying your skills as a writer, lifting up stories that often are either not told, or when they're told, when a writer is not super knowledgeable on the topic, it can really go sideways. So it's clear you're having just a huge impact in the world of sports right now. And you also talk about just doing it. You're taking advantage of these stretch opportunities. And I think sometimes for some folks, there's a fear, this idea of an imposter syndrome of, well, I've never written about the MMA, so I'm just not going to do that. I'm not qualified. And you're clearly someone who dives in and you see an opportunity, you take it. I think something that's helpful for our listeners to really understand more about who you are is being able to respond to times as a writer in the workplace. And it sounds like you've had a really positive experience at ESPN. So maybe thinking about other times where you might have been working with a team and you encountered a situation where it was really difficult for you to be 100% authentic, to be who you are, and just thinking about yourself as a queer person of color. Can you think of a specific scenario of just encountering workplace bias or just covering aspects of who you are just because you needed to get a project done and you didn't want to ruffle feathers or you didn't want to encounter someone who might be confrontational? If you could share that time with our listeners, I think it's going to really help understand that this comes up for all of us in different ways. And if you can share how you may have worked around that particular scenario to at least have a positive outcome, that could absolutely help in just sharing some really specific skills that I think our listeners are looking for right now as they think about starting their own business and not compromising aspects of who they are.
For me, especially being so young, I'm 26, and my identity and my understanding of my identity and myself grows and changes pretty consistently. And so I've used different words at different times to describe how I identify. And I've really settled into this non-binary space, and that's happened throughout the time that I've been at ESPN. And so that's challenging. I think as somebody who particularly uses like gender neutral pronouns, I use they, them, there's always that time when I'm mispronounced or, referred to with gendered language, which doesn't always bother me, but it sometimes bothers me to decide, am I going to correct this person in this moment? And what is my relationship with this person? Is this my boss? Is this my boss's boss? Is it my boss's boss's boss? Or is it somebody that I'm on an equal level with? And, is this somebody I work with on a regular basis? Or is this just a quick interaction? And how am I going to expend this energy at this moment? And do I feel unsafe? And so those are constant questions that I ask myself, not just within the workplace, but just honestly in how I navigate the world. And so when I was first starting my professional career at a larger company, it was hard to really figure out, how am I going to ask for this level of affirmation? How am I going to then hold my people accountable to that level of affirmation? And what I found was really helpful was I cultivated some allies within my organization, and I had talked with my bosses who were totally on board. And it's not always perfect, but in the moments when it really matters, my boss's boss and our deputy editor, they fight a lot of battles for me and protect me in many ways. And that's something that I was not expecting to have happen. And it's been really invaluable just to trust folks. And I made a decision when I came to ESPN that I was going to be willing to educate. And that's not something that everybody feels like they want to do, and that's okay. But it was something that I wanted to do. And so when I got here and I was having these conversations about what being non-binary means, what using gender neutral pronouns means, what does this look like, how do we write this, I have found that it has inadvertently had this ripple effect where everyone has become more educated on this topic. And so when I wrote that piece on G. Ryan, and I said I'm using gender neutral pronouns the whole way through, the copy desk was like, okay, this makes sense to us.
That's awesome.
Because that groundwork had already been laid. And so, I think it's challenging, but I have found that cultivating allies is really important and having those conversations. And then when necessary, communicating when something has just become untenable with people that you trust. I think it's hard to do, but that level of open communication, I think, is really important for folks. Oftentimes when we say to someone, hey, you said this and it hurt me in this way, there's a tendency for that person to become defensive. And understanding that is that first response and trying to mitigate that, because if they're defensive, they aren't necessarily going to hear what you have to say. I have found that those things have been really helpful for me, not just, within the walls of my employer, but also just in trying to live this world in a way that most people don't.
Wow. Okay. So you've given a lot of really amazing strategies to help listeners navigate being their authentic selves in the workplace. If there's one piece of advice that you can help our listeners hone in on to conquer that fear and to just unapologetically be themselves, what would that be?
I think use your best judgment. There is a tendency to say that it's all going to be fine once you explain everything. And I don't think that is always true. Like there are folks in my life with whom I just don't have conversations about certain things. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes you may feel unsafe, and if you do feel unsafe, trust your gut in that way. But often I think, we will conflate that with allowing fear to sort of dictate our lives. And I don't think that is always the best way to go about things. And so there are people everywhere who care very deeply about being an affirming presence in every LGBTQ person's life, just as there are people everywhere who hold homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic beliefs. And, I think living in Connecticut, folks assume that like everything's fine. But like I grew up in Indiana and most things were fine for me in the place that I grew up in Indiana, even though Indiana can be particularly horrifying politically for LGBTQ people. And so I think listening to yourself as well as challenging your fear when it makes sense to do so is particularly important.
That's super powerful. So listen to kind of that inner voice, your intuition, and just be brave and power through the fear. So this is an awesome interview. And what we're going to do right now is take a very short sponsorship break. And when we come back, we're going to get to know Katie just a little bit better. So please stick around.
HR and diversity professionals. Are you struggling with engaging LGBTQ talent? Do you stay awake at night worrying about limiting litigation risks? Have you considered seeking support around these concerns, but just aren't sure where to turn? Look no further. Rhodes Perry Consulting offers you solutions with the Engaging LGBTQ Talent A to Z certification. This proven 4-week mentorship program delivers skills, offers support, and connects you with other professionals committed to transforming themselves and their workplaces. Learn more about this cutting-edge program by visiting rhodesperry.com and use the promo code RPC for a 10% discount. Take action and visit rhodesperry.com.
Welcome back, Outbosses. We are now going into our bonus round where we'll have the opportunity to get to know Katie just a little bit better, gain some insights on how we can bring our whole selves to work, and then learn one way that we can stay in touch with Katie after today's conversation. So Katie, are you ready for the bonus round questions?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Okay. So did your LGBTQ identity hold you back from taking the leap to being a journalist and working at ESPN, or did it speed up the process for you?
Totally sped up the process. I never once worried about being an LGBTQ writer at ESPN, and actually was like, hey, you should hire me because you need me. And that was really helpful.
Yeah. And I'm sure that whoever made the decision to hire you has been promoted probably 50 times over because of all that you've contributed. So smart move on their part. So in one sentence, what does it mean to bring your whole self to work?
It means showing up authentically in whatever way is most appropriate for you.
Nice. And what's one personal habit that helps you master yourself and your business?
I like to swim in the mornings. It centers me and grounds me, and I can't be on my phone. And all I have is myself and the water.
Nice.
So I have a lot of.
Yeah, that consistency and the quiet time, in a culture where we're constantly connected and distracted by screen time, super smart. So name one thing that you readily delegate in your everyday work to stay focused on what you're good at.
I would say I always try and take a couple of moments while I'm at work to just think about where I want to go, and will sort of plug in different ways and just kind of like scroll and be looking at news and things like that. But also I'm just like thinking during that time. I think anytime that I can have 20 minutes to just contemplate by myself, it's really helpful. I've become more introverted over time and have found that I really need that time, and it just keeps me grounded and focused.
Yeah, so maybe just kind of delegating some time out where you can have that psychic energy to kind of hone in on finding that creative edge of like, oh, this is the thing that I have to write about today. So that's helpful. Mm-hmm. Is there a book or a podcast that has contributed to your success as the journalist that you are today?
Yes. So I love podcasts, but I would say that I listen to podcasts now for interviewing reasons and to listen to how other folks are phrasing their questions. But Another Round, which is a BuzzFeed podcast, is one that I listen to a lot and I talk about a lot. just in terms of feeling like, what can fun sound like? And what does that mean for me and my work? As somebody who sort of sits in the heavy things a lot. That's a place that I go to a lot.
Okay, just a few more questions now. So can you share one piece of advice to inspire those folks that are thinking about taking that first step towards being their own boss?
I would say to, in some ways, be brave. And I kind of hate that word because it implies that the converse of that is, being a coward. And I don't love that. But in this sense, I think it works. To be brave and to trust yourself and what you want, and just to go after that. It's super cliche, but I think that the best thing that we can do for ourselves as LGBTQ people is to be happy, because it's hard enough to do that in this world.
Nice. So Katie, can you share one way that we can stay in touch with you and learn more about your writing and where we can read it online?
Yeah. Can I give you 3?
Yes, absolutely.
They're short. So ESPNW.com is my home. It's where all of my ESPN work typically shows up. kebarnes.com is my website, and there's a contact form on that if you ever want to get in touch with me or see what I'm up to or follow my Tumblr. And then on Twitter, I'm at Katie_Barnes3, and I'm really active there, and you can DM me whenever you want.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for your time and for inspiring fellow outbosses. So for everybody who's listening in, thank you for tuning into this week's episode. It is always my privilege to connect with you and so many inspiring outbosses, journalists, writers like Katie. As a next step, check out the show notes for highlights from today's conversation, subscribe to the podcast, and consider leaving your honest feedback so that I can share it, and I'm happy to start reading those comments online. So for now, keep being your authentic selves 100% of the time.